introduce myself. I'm Carrie Wimberly, and I'm the Executive Director at the Addiction Prevention Coalition. It's my husband, Art. I'm going to let him introduce himself as well. These webinars have been put on by lots of different organizations. We've done a series. It's called Why Won't They Stop? Family Support Series of webinars and craft trainings. I believe this is our fourth one in the series. And up until now, you've been hearing from different organizations, UAB Addiction Recovery, UAB Beacon Recovery, and you'll hear from other ones, Not One More, Drug Education Council. Tonight, this is kind of the APC's webinar, so Art and I are doing it. I loosely say we lead the parent support group here in Birmingham. There's another one in Shelby County that Dave Urick leads, but really Art leads that. I come and add a little when I can, but he's really the primary leader. But we are here tonight not really as professionals. I don't have a counseling degree or a degree in mental health. We're here really as parents who have been through this. We have two sons who've had significant struggles with substance use disorder, and we've been in recovery and leading parent groups in recovery for how long? 15 years?
Closer to 20.
20 years. So this is from two people, parents that have been through this struggle and have been doing parent support. So we're not professionals. You're looking at parents more than professionals tonight. But Art, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, Art, as Carrie said, Carrie's husband. We celebrate 30 years this year of marriage. I'm a person grateful to be in long-term recovery myself, also a certified recovery coach. And as Carrie said, for the last 22 years, we've both been in recovery, primarily for our son's addictions, but also I worked on my own. And then for about 20 years, probably about 2 years into our own recovery, we began volunteering to lead support groups for families. So glad to be with you.
Thank you, Art. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do a teaching. The title of this was Loss of Control, and we're going to be focused on what is known as the Al-Anon's 3 C's that you hear every time you go to an Al-Anon meeting, and then we've kind of added a 4th C to it. So we'll get into that in just a minute. I'm going to launch a PowerPoint, but what we're going to do is we're going to kind of walk through those C's and what that means to parents and spouses and families that are dealing with a loved one with a substance use disorder. And then as we get to as we finish up the 3rd C, we sat down with a friend and did a little interview just about our story. That's something that we're doing with each one of these webinars is we're doing a little bit of teaching and then we're doing some sort of story. So Art and I are just going to tell our story about, walking through the addictions of our sons and what that meant to us and our relationship and the rest of the family dynamics, etc. So we're going to watch that video together, and then we'll come back together, finish the teaching, and then do some Q&A and close it out. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the webinars that are coming up later. So anything I forgot, Art?
I think that covered it. There was one question. RM just said that there's no sound, but I think everybody else seems to be hearing us okay, I believe.
Okay, so can you guys hear us?
We get a thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, awesome. That's pretty scary. Okay, so Art, when I launch this PowerPoint, I don't think I'm going to be able to see the chat box anymore.
Okay,
So
I'll watch it.
You're going to have to watch it for us. All righty, so hang on just a second. All right, can you see that? Okay, all right. So loss of control, part of the Why Won't They Stop series. Shout out to all of these organizations who have partnered together. All of them do tremendous family support work, and we're proud to be able to partner with them in this initiative. And we've already talked about that. Okay, so the C's for families. Art, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, if you've ever been to an Al-Anon meeting, that was pivotal for Carrie and I in the first couple of years of our own journey. The first thing we kind of encountered, and as she said, the one thing that was kind of there every week was called the 3 C's of Al-Anon, and it's you did not cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. We've added a fourth one we're going to talk about later tonight, but we're going to run through those first 3 as you get introduced to them from an Al-Anon perspective, and why it's so important for whether you're a parent, a spouse, a sibling, or just a concerned significant other in relationship with someone who's struggling with substance use disorder, why learning these 3 are vitally important on our journey. Okay, first one, you didn't cause it. I didn't cause it. One of the toughest things for loved ones when addiction enters the picture in a family is the idea that maybe something we did, the way we raised our children or the way we were spouses or siblings, somehow we contributed. But the U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has this quote: addiction is not a moral failing. It is a chronic illness that must be treated with skill, urgency, and compassion. And one of the things that kind of gets in the way for us, if we think that we caused our loved one's addiction, is a lot of the idea of skill and compassion kind of can go out the door pretty quickly. So we're going to cover several things that I think most loved ones need to know about when they're either entering into this idea of family addiction, or maybe if you've been on the road for a while, on the journey for a while. We're going to bring up a number of points that we had to have addressed with us, that we had to learn and educate ourselves about, and then it had to do a lot of work on. The first one is parental guilt or shame. If you're a parent out there, you may have experienced this when you first had to deal with your child's addiction. You may have felt a lot of guilt or shame around that. It's pretty natural for parents, but it's one of those things that can easily get in the way of us being healthy in dealing with that. So a lot of our early work was having to resolve the guilt and shame we felt. That was one of the things for us that isolated us for a while. Carrie, do you remember that first?
Yeah, I was going to, let me say something right here. So, you know, we talk about this when anytime we're telling our story, but, you know, as an organization, one of the things that we do are trainings and events just to get people to start talking about substance use disorder, because there is such a stigma and there is so much shame involved in it. And that keeps people from getting the help that they need in a timely manner. But that is also present in families. So I know that, you know, we had 4 boys at home, and we had a big community, lots of neighbors. We were at the ball field, just a big group of people that we did life with when all this, you know, started happening. And at one by one, naturally, as it came out, parents started, you know, kind of reining in their children and saying, hey, that's not a good situation for you to be involved with our kids, which was accurate. But they didn't really know what to do, I think, with us. And so what that meant was just a lot of isolation and quiet when there had been so many relationships. So as a mom, that really was difficult for me. And I felt ashamed. I felt like we as parents had failed because our job was to help our kids be successful and productive and all those things. And because they were, struggling so significantly with substance use, that meant that we had failed them and that we had really failed our community. So that's something, and we'll, on the next slide, we'll talk about what that guilt and shame, if not paid attention to and worked through, how it can cause us to do things that are not healthy.
Yeah, and the second point we talked about is called the if onlys. If onlys can sound kind of like this: if only I had been there more, if only I had participated more in their school activities, or if only I had been the coach on the baseball team, or if only we'd gone to church more. So there's an endless number of list of if onlys that parents or spouses even or siblings can go through to begin taking responsibility and trying to spot a reason that the lack of that is what caused their acting out with substance.
And then also observing the past realistically. When we're in our parent group every week and we're talking about, okay, I know looking back, if I could do it again, I would do some things differently. So it's not that we're saying we know our children had a perfect childhood and we made no mistakes as parents. That's not true. It is the acknowledgement of the reality of, there were some things that we did really well, and there were some things that we didn't do well. And not to avoid that, to acknowledge it, to accept the reality of that, to learn how to forgive ourselves and others, including our children, for pain and difficulty that we walk through, and then in a healthy way, working through those things in order that you can move on, not trying to push it to the side and say that didn't happen, but really learning how to deal with that in a realistic and in a healthy way.
Yeah, but I know for myself, looking back before addiction entered the picture for our two sons, I could certainly think of many times where there were normal childhood family things that I didn't handle well, or handled perhaps with too much anger, or maybe even too much kind of being aloof from things. And so the key is not to reject those things or not acknowledge that they existed, but then to not take those on as the cause of the addictive behavior, and then keep us from getting healthy and educated and actually beginning to do the right things.
And for you guys, if any of you were actually on the first webinar that we did, it was really a introductory explanation and training around why we call substance use disorder a disease. And it is a disease, and there is, brain components, and it's complex. So that's a part of, as a family member, learning and getting educated about the disease of addiction so that we can help understand the process that our loved ones went through and are going through, and how they got to the place they are at, because it is more than just a decision to use. It's more complicated than that. Okay, so just going to touch on this just briefly because we got to move on, but it is also important to understand the link between childhood trauma and substance use disorder, because there is a significant link. So if your child, or if you know somebody that is struggling with substance use disorder that experienced any sort of trauma, there is a link. And the information here just says, experiences that are stress-inducing and traumatic are linked to an elevated vulnerability to addiction. And those things include trauma, neglect, loss of a parent, violence in the home, or even a family member who suffers from mental illness or substance use disorder. So all of these things impact a person and can impact them to a point of leading to a substance use disorder. Approximately over 60% of people with a substance use disorder report encountering some sort of trauma as a child. So that's a very common report when people go to treatment that comes up, early and often. So that's something that we just need to be aware of.
And we mentioned this earlier in the did not cause area. Why is guilt important to resolve? Well, if we think we caused it, it can impact what we do now. How do we go forward? What are some of the ways it can impact it negatively? We can be overhelpers, we can be enablers, or conversely, we can become way too stoic, that is aloof and removed emotionally from the situation, or we could become hard-hearted, setting up concrete boundaries that become barriers, or we can become overly driven by emotion if we haven't done the work to resolve the guilt and the shame.
Okay, so one person did put in the chat that asking for the recording. So what we do with all of these webinars is once we are recording this, once I get the recording, which should be early next week, I will send out an email to everybody that is registered for this through Eventbrite and give you the link to the recording. Also, you can request through that email the slides if you want the slides. So yes, the answer is yes. Okay, we can't control it. The only person I can control is myself. And that seems really simple until you find yourself involved with someone struggling with substance use.
I remember when I first started doing 12-step work for my own addiction, the depth of step one in AA just simply says we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our life was unmanageable. In Al-Anon, you substitute alcohol for other people's choices. So we admit we are powerless over other people's choices. So we're learning that we're not in control. We probably had the illusion of some control, but we're learning we have much less than we thought we did. So parenting, of course, good parenting is about levels of control with a child, and at certain ages, we have certain amounts of control, but not ultimate control. We never had ultimate control, even if we thought we did. When substance use disorder or substance use enters the picture, it actually begins to expose just how much control we actually had and where our illusions around that control were. So it's important for us at this stage to acknowledge that much of our behavior going forward is ultimately going to be about control one way or the other. And we've got to get educated about where that's wise and where it's not. Carrie, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that was important in my journey is that when I still felt like we had control, we could do this and then we could do that, and the behavior would change. I was very active. I mean, both in my mind and physically active, doing things. What's the next thing, the next thing, the next thing? It was when we realized we didn't have control and it was time for us to step back and all of that activity stopped, that I realized what was under that desire to control, and it was an incredible amount of fear. And so it's important for us to get to the place that we can really see that and feel that fear and see that it is pushing us to certain behaviors, so that we can then make a choice. Is that a healthy behavior or an unhealthy behavior? Because I could not have told you before then that it was that fear down under that was really driving a lot of that chaotic behavior that I was doing, trying to control the use.
Yeah. And so we needed help outside of ourselves. We founded originally in Al-Anon, as we said earlier. That was in Birmingham, Alabama, 23 years ago. That seemed to be probably about the only place you could find it. And it was a great one for us. I think going to meetings over the next year or two after the problems started popping up gave us a lot of balance, began to teach us about some things we didn't see about ourselves. Eventually, we also were fortunate enough to find a Celebrate Recovery in the area that did 12-step work. And so it was just the power of community each week that began to change us in that journey. Carrie, you want to pick it up from there?
Yep. We get a lot of calls here. We get opportunities to talk to lots of families that are struggling. And we always encourage the families, yes, let's get your loved one some help. Absolutely. But then you need to find your place. You need to find your circle of people, because information is power to change, and it's power to change us first. And that comes in community. Another thing that happens once you start reaching out and getting help, and I know in our parents' circle, when new parents walk in, you can see the anxiety, but then just in the introduction, when we go around and introduce ourselves and people say, hey, this is my situation, this is my loved one, this is how long we've been dealing with it, it's almost like you can see them relax into the chair. There's just something about the power of community that we desperately need as families going through this. And as we deal with that, as we get the help that we need, there is a acceptance that comes with that, and acceptance of the reality of the situation that we're going through. But that acceptance does not mean hopelessness. There are periods of hopelessness that come as families, and we certainly walked through those, but an acceptance of the reality of where you are and what you do as a parent that's healthy and encouraging and helpful, and then stopping the behaviors that are not helpful brings an acceptance that is important. It's important for your own journey personally. It's important for your health and your other relationships.
Karen, I think another point about acceptance is that not only does it not mean hopelessness, but it does not also mean that you're condoning the behavior as well. I think that confuses people sometimes.
Yeah.
The third C is you can't cure it. We didn't cause it. We're not going to control it. And we're probably not going to be a big part of the cure either. One of the sayings we use at our Parents of Addicted Loved Ones meeting is, I'll always love you, but how I love you has to change. Or another version is, I'll always love you, but how I help you has to change, or how I relate to you has to change. And that's a big part of the learning curve in one of our support meetings. We are probably, in most cases, the vast majority, the parents or the spouses are not most likely not going to be the primary change agent in someone's decision to get better. We can influence them, and we'll talk about that at the end of tonight, but we're generally not the primary change agent. It's usually a combination of our child or our spouses, our loved one's own journey, with other outside resources, 12-step groups, sponsors, circumstances, friends, legal issues, etc., that actually lead to change. And one of the things that we had to learn early and still have to learn every day is the idea about resistance to change. Every human being on the planet has some resistance to change. Some of us have more than others, but we all have it. But when substance use disorder enters the picture, the resistance to change kind of goes on steroids. And that also, though, is true for us as family members or loved ones. We have to take a hard look at what we're not willing to change and then begin to do the work of change. Once we realize we're not their cure, then we can at least relax into doing the work of change for ourselves. So one of the things that slowly can happen is we begin to change roles. We kind of get out of the coaching role and maybe become a cheerleader. We get out of trying to tell them what to do and maybe trying to figuring out what we need to do differently or how to help motivate them, but not tell them what to do. Everybody, though, in family systems is on a different journey. Different ages have different issues. When we began to deal with our two sons within 6 months of each other, one was 19 and one was 17. So we had two different sets of issues. One had gone away to college, one was still in high school. So the details of what we were dealing with and our responsibilities were a little different, but some of the basics were still the same. And one of those was we had to learn how to get out of the way in both cases to let them fall when they had to, and for us to do our own work. And the truth is, some of the stuff we had to learn was counterintuitive as parents. Had to unlearn a lot of stuff that was about typical parenting once substance use disorder came into play, and especially for our older son who had gone to school, was out of our home. There were a lot of things that we had to learn about dropping parental roles at that point, and it took us, I would say, at least a year or two, Carrie, probably to figure that out. Would you agree?
Yep. I was going to say, in our parent group that we meet with every week, the ages and stages around that circle are anywhere from, I think, 18 to in a child in their 40s. So, one of the things that we have learned over this 2 decades is it really is different pathways to recovery for every single person. And there, unfortunately, as families, there is no recipe for success. So it is a process of figuring it out and letting them figure it out, letting them find their path so that it is their path that they choose. I can remember when our older son went to treatment the first time, came home for a visit, and, we were terrified for that weekend visit, and he was going to go to a meeting. And we were like, hey, you want us to drive you or whatever? And he, very gently, but said, okay, this is my recovery and I have to work it. You cannot work my recovery for me. And that was hard. I wanted to work his recovery for him. And that was really one of the dynamics that was exposed when he went to treatment, and then we started getting some help. Okay, so, all right, let's answer one question here, and then we're gonna start the video. So you want to read that, Art, and see?
Yeah, what do you do when the person with substance use disorder also suffers from mental illness such as bipolar disorder, depression, and anxiety? That's a really good question, because unfortunately it's fairly common for that to happen, to be a dual diagnosis. So the first thing I think is important is, if you know you've got a diagnosis of mental illness outside of the substance use disorder, is if your loved one is willing, can you find them the right treatment? Can you get them to the right medical agency? Fortunately, in Birmingham, we've got a few more resources now than we did 20 years ago when we were getting into this. The ROSS, ROSS, what else, Carrie? We've got Recovery Resource Center. There's several places now that can help get you to another resource. The key is going to be, is your loved one that's struggling willing to either be diagnosed or to be treated? But the key is actually getting them to the right treatment as quickly as possible. One of the great recovery stories in Birmingham is Mark Litvine of Ross, who struggles with mental illness at a very deep level, and because it was disguised by his substance use disorder, and it took a number of years and a number of false starts before anybody came in and exposed that and then got him the help he needed. Fortunately, today we've got a lot more resources to help with that kind of thing. if the person that's asking the question has a specific loved one in mind that she's looking for help for, we'd be glad to help her after we get off through with the webinar tonight.
Right. Okay, guys, so we're going to swap over to the video interview of our story. Again, feel free to put questions in the chat, and when we get through with this, we have a little more teaching, and then we will have a good 10-15 minutes at the end to answer any questions or have any conversation that you guys are interested in. So oh, wait, I did that wrong. Hang on.
I'm Ronnie Gatry, producer and moderator of this discussion of the Family Support Series for the Addiction Prevention Coalition. Today we have Art and Carrie Wimberly joining us in this discussion. Art, Carrie.
Hey,
Hey,
good morning, Ronnie.
thanks for having us.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me. What are we talking about here? So first, to get started, tell us a little bit about your family before the substance use began.
Yeah, well, in many ways we were kind of typical, but actually we had both been married before and had children, and so then we had a blended family of 5 children, married in 1992, which means this is 30 years this
Yep.
year we're celebrating.
Wow.
But we had about a decade where things were tough, but we were actually blending the families well, we thought, and things were progressing on. But then about 10 years in, we hit a really dangerous, tough spot.
Yep. We started noticing some use from our oldest son. And, you know, at the beginning thought it was just normal, typical teenage behavior. But then as it progressed, we began to get nervous about that.
Yeah. Okay. And so, like most families, we took some steps, grounded him as a senior in high school, talked a lot about it, kind of probably yelled a lot about it from my perspective, got angry at times, and thought that was the way to kind of get it stopped. And I guess for a while it seemed to stop, but probably had kind of gone underground, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. As he was preparing to go to college, there were just some things beginning to drop. And, you know, that was really my, when I look back, I really played the wrong role in that because I did not want him to lose his opportunity to go to college. Thought, okay, if we just get through this little bump in the road, everything will be okay. So I helped too much, didn't let the consequences happen naturally as they should have at that period of time.
Yeah, and so he went on off to school. I think I ignored a couple of things as well. It wasn't directly about his use, but it was kind of the things that maybe were coming from the use that we didn't see, such as his savings account disappeared, and some other things that we had said were a precursor to going away to school didn't happen. But as you said, I think both of us were wanting to get on with life and progress through, and we probably ignored a couple of things.
Right.
Yeah.
That was a little bit more than you asked for. But.
No, that's fine. That's fine. One of the things I thought of as you were drawing this out were the signs. You mentioned the savings account start to dwindle. Were there any behavioral signs that you noticed in your children or in this child in particular?
The most stark one was a change in the friend group. He had the same friends for many, many years, and then all of a sudden he's not hanging with those and he's hanging with new friends that we really didn't know that well. Also, there was a change in sleeping patterns, where was coming in, when he was supposed to most of the time, but just absolutely could not get him up in the morning, especially on the weekends. And that was not his typical. He normally was a pretty easy riser. We said it was teenage stuff, but now looking back, I could tell that it was use.
The other one I think that was really screaming at us that we missed was his kind of dropping away from his athletic endeavors, his disciplines,
Yes.
and then deciding to let go of those and
Yeah.
giving us an excuse probably didn't make sense, but we accepted.
Right.
And again, we're not going back and knocking ourselves for this.
Right.
It's just simply looking back now, those signs were a little clearer than we thought they were.
Right. And the almost aggressive, negative attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Did not want to do anything with the family, was sharp, any type of thing that didn't go his way, just really difficult to be with, which again is, a lot of teenage behavior. So it's hard to put your finger on it. But, when you see all of these things at one time, it's a real indicator there's a problem.
Yeah. And so we ended up letting him go on away out of town to school. And within a few months began to noticing things. And from afar, it's hard to tell. But the glimpses we got, the few communications we had, which was another indicator, seemed to be avoiding us. We eventually found out that things had really gone off the track once he was in that environment.
Right.
How did the substance use begin?
It's a good question and hard to know exactly, but I think in high school, probably maybe junior year, maybe before, there was some use of alcohol he was hiding from us, and eventually he got busted a couple of times. I think by the time he was a senior, maybe an incident or two where he had been smoking marijuana, but nothing huge and outrageous, and they seemed to be kind of few and far between. And we felt like at some point, because we knew and because we grounded or because we restricted or because we punished or because I yelled or whatever other nagging or that we did, that we felt like we kind of had it under control.
And I think, one of the things he shared with us later was, I guess at a party, they have these farm parties where they clean out the medicine cabinets and they put a bowl in the middle of the table and everybody just puts the pills that they have cleaned out, and you pick one out, don't even know what you're taking, and you take it. Matt shared that when he took an opioid the first time, it was euphoric for him from the very first time. So I know that was, and that's something, in our work, working with parents and teaching them about prevention, this is one of the things that we try to get to parents before their children have a sports injury or a dental procedure, because a lot of times that's the child's introduction to a narcotic pain medication. But it's just because our brains receive that differently. When I take one, I feel horrible. But he indicated, from the very beginning, and that is one of the precursors for somebody that is at danger for a substance use disorder is, taking that first pill and having that reaction that is so pleasurable that they then chase that high, that feeling. So,
yeah, and that was that thing he was much later, many years later, through decades of addiction, was able to share with us when he got sober, was an example of what you were talking about, that we had no clue that extreme of being at a party where they were just taking something out of the bowl and using it, and no clue that had happened.
All right, just so I'm certain, these details weren't revealed to you until well into the recovery process. Is that
yes.
correct?
Decade,
long
well
time.
over a decade later, when thankfully he was able to get some help and eventually aged out of the use and got sober for an extended period of time and was able to tell us the truth about some of the story.
Let's lean into the impact this had on the rest of the family, going back to your discovery of these changes in behavior.
We have 5 children together. We had custody of them when we got married, so it really was a formed family. Most of the time they were visiting their other parents on the weekend, alternating weekends and such. But I would say that when this started, and our second son right behind that, his use started probably a year later, maybe.
Well, actually, once we put the stories back together, he was actually using 2, but it was quieter and under the surface, and then it exploded the same year that Matt went off the rail. So
Right.
within 6 months, we found out, okay, now we're dealing with 2
Right.
that are going off the rails, and then we've still got 2 smaller children at home
Right.
that we're trying to parent.
Yep.
We both had jobs and careers and a
Yep.
life.
Yep.
And so it began to affect everything about the family system.
Yes.
Marriage, parenting,
Yes.
paying attention. So much attention and energy was being paid to the crisis children. And we call them children, but by then they were 18, 19, or 20.
Right.
Right. And so our energy and time and focus for the rest of the family
Yes.
was really waning.
Yes. So the attention to detail for the 2 smaller children was way low. And the emotional, I guess, having enough emotion to deal with them as you would normally, it just wasn't there. I mean, I was exhausted and, worried sick to the point of almost all my waking hours were, what are we going to do? What's next? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing?
Yeah. Are these other 2 children who are adults by now even alive today?
Right.
Yeah. And so the combination of fear, anger, and shame and guilt, the mixture, that cocktail we were living in and swimming in,
Yes.
was draining us of time, energy, function in every aspect of our family.
Let's lean into the impact it had on the marriage.
Yes.
Tough. We were existing, I would say, for quite a while, barely existing.
And I think because as it got worse, we dealt with that in different ways. Okay. So I can't escape it. I mean, it's with me, all the time. Art seemed to be able to disconnect enough to do his job. And so he wasn't feeling the amount of emotion that I was, the amount of time that I was. Okay. So that in itself caused conflict because I'm like, I'm dying here. And you're like, not dying. Why, why not? So trying to make him be more hysterical because I thought that meant that we were equally in the same place. We have varying degrees of connection with them depending on where they were in their use. They would, like, Matt was really good at figuring out what he could say to me to get me to do what he wanted me to do. Okay. And so he's, Art's much stronger in that way than I was. So that caused problem because what started to happen was because I didn't want to lose the relationship with Matt, I would give in, but I would keep that as a secret. I wouldn't tell Art that I gave in. So as that behavior progressed, that put even more of a wedge because I didn't want him to figure out what I was doing. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So Matt was using, us against each other. That we were not sharing.
Yeah.
So there's another divider.
Yeah, and there's another dynamic that came into play from my side is, as Carrie charitably was saying, I wasn't quite as hysterical, but the truth was I wasn't healthy about it either. I was suppressing all that and just acting like everything was okay, which meant she had no real emotional support or place to go. In fact, I could get irritated and angry if she brought it up too much. So we were out of balance in that way. The other interesting thing that came about probably a year or so, 2 into the process, was you were starting to get a lot more educated and healthier than I was. My ability to stay in denial was keeping me from learning, and you were starting to learn some things. And I can remember one phone call, one of the rare phone calls with Matt. I listened for a few minutes and I said, I think things are a lot better. And I handed you the phone. You spoke to him for 30 seconds and you handed it back and said he's still using. I was blocking. I was way overly optimistic about things because I didn't want to feel the pain.
This is when we started attending, some support groups, Al-Anon, and so that's when, speaking of family support, since this is what we're speaking about, that was a critical piece to us moving into a healthier space, was getting in a room where these conversations were normal and there were people in those rooms that were like us, because the isolation that came with this was tremendous from a community standpoint. We had a ton of friends and just a great network, and this was a crisis, and when it started happening, the kids were in high school. And so you get to that place where other families are telling their children, you can't hang out with the Wimberleys, as they rightly should have, because it was bad. But what happened in that is we lost our community, for the most part.
Yeah, we either were withdrawing from them because of the guilt and the shame,
Right,
and not wanting to bring it up, or
Right.
some of them rightly were trying to protect their own children, and so they probably withdrew from us a little bit. And so it was critical, as you said, to begin to find a place where we could go talk about this and get some support and begin to lose some of the guilt and shame.
Yes.
And getting into 12 steps in Al-Anon was crucial.
Right.
We began, I never forget, early in the process when I was still a little dead to everything, you were starting to hear from some of those simple step lessons in a group.
Yes.
And some of the topics and some of the questions,
Yeah.
and it was starting to stir you up and break you open a little bit.
Right.
And I was way behind on that. But it was crucial that was an early aspect of saying, we've got to fight through the shame and the guilt.
Yes.
And we've got to go someplace where it's safe to talk about this and other people are ahead of us
Yeah.
in this. So Al-Anon was the first.
Yes.
And it was crucial. That eventually led us into Celebrate Recovery.
Well,
Right.
well, if I
Yeah,
could,
yes. Yeah.
just thinking about the scope of the recovery process.
Yes.
It began with Al-Anon, correct?
Yes.
So just to give me context, the next step of this recovery journey is,
Well,
I guess.
in addition to going to Al-Anon, and the reason we went to Al-Anon was because we sought out a private therapist or counselor to help us, which was kind of the first step into help. But honestly, at that point, I think we went there thinking they're going to fix our children.
Right.
Right. And when they eventually said, no, we're not going to be able to fix your children because you're the ones here. We got to start with you. And then they said, in addition to coming here, we'd like you to seek out a support group.
Yeah.
Well, in Birmingham, Alabama, and 1999, 2000, 22 years ago, well, that was pretty much Al-Anon. Thank goodness it was there. But that was about all there was at that time, I think. But eventually from there, as we saw a therapist and a counselor, and then we were doing the 12-step meetings, and eventually we were introduced to a similar 12-step process, but it was faith-based, and it was called Celebrate Recovery. So we began looking at that material. And Carrie, again, was way ahead of me, and she's like, okay, here it is. This is a support, too. We can do this.
Right.
Remember?
Yeah. When we started going to the Al-Anon meetings, my dad was a functioning alcoholic. So the conversations in those circles very much resonated with me and began to, illuminate patterns of behavior and beliefs and all the things that I had brought from my family of origin and brought into this home. So for the first time, my eyes were opened to the fact that, talking about the 4 C's, we didn't cause it, we can't control it, can't cure it, but we can contribute. Okay, my contribution right now is unhealthy. So I didn't know exactly what healthy looked like, but I knew that I needed to figure that out.
Yeah, you even said one night after the group, we started coming here because of the boys, but what I'm hearing is about me.
Yep.
And that was crucial.
Yep.
That nuance. And then starting to figure out how to disentangle. We didn't cause it. We're not going to control it. We're not going to be the cure of it. But then how now then do I look at my contribution as a husband and a father in a family system with 2 addicted sons?
Yes.
And how do I go forward with this, knowing I'm not the primary cure for them?
So to kind of answer your question, what you started with, there was a long period of time where we truly were having to learn and focus on our own recoveries because our sons were still using and still out there. And at that point, as it progressed, I mean, there were years of where we had very little influence and very little contact because they were out, you know. So we were left with, okay, what do we do now? You know, what can we do to help them? But are we going to take the time and the attention to put our marriage back together, to refocus on the children that needed our attention, that had almost been neglected because of what we had been focused on? Or are we going to stay in this chaotic state that we had been in for so long, you know, that almost had become our new normal?
Yeah.
So it was almost like we had to break that cycle to get back to a place of doing the hard work of our marriage and refocusing on the things that normal families would be refocused on, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
curious, what was that breaking point? What was it that was like, okay, enough?
Something happened where I really snapped, and that meant on the floor of the bathroom wailing. I mean, for over an hour. And I mean, it was an unconscious, it was outside of myself. I don't know. It was just a breaking. And I think that was the beginning of the realization that I couldn't solve it.
I'm not in control.
I'm not in control. And I mean, that loss of control was foundational for me to get out of the every waking thought about what I was going to do to fix everybody and everything to I can't. So where do I go from here?
Which is really the first step, right? In AA, they would say, you know, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our life had become unmanageable. For us, we had to reframe it, and we admitted we were powerless over other people's choices, and our life has become unmanageable, which is first step. I've got to let go of the illusion that I've got control of all of this. Yeah.
So, I mean, that really sent me to, and I was already in a Celebrate Recovery system. I was in a step study when all this happened. So walking through the steps, and I have a sponsor. So as I'm going, you know, it is truly about me, you know, at that point, and looking at the inventory of my life and the people I had hurt and the people that had hurt me, and forgiveness and making amends. And that gave me a sense of, once going through that inventory process, gave me a sense of looking over patterns. Okay. So that revealed the patterns that I was repeating in my marriage and with my children that I had learned in other relationships that were unhealthy and destructive and not, you know, I thought they were good because I'm going to figure out what you need to do, and then I'm going to influence you to do those things. that all sounded really good in my head. But when it was laid out on a table in front of me, it was like, holy cow, I've got a lot of work to do.
And it's important right here, I think, for us to step in and remind people that what Carrie's describing and the process I'll describe too, in seeing those patterns, again, as soon as you see them, if you're not careful, then you start saying, yeah, I was the cause.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yes. So it's really important when you do the work like this, whatever system you do it in, is when you begin to notice your own patterns that need to be changed, character defects, shortcomings, whatever you want to call them, that you don't immediately go back and grab, oh, see, I was the cause.
Right.
Right. But no, what it's saying is that going forward, if you want to contribute to your health and the health of the family system and hopefully influence the son or daughter or loved one who's struggling with substance use disorder, these are necessary patterns for me to change regardless of how it affects them.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'd ask about the relationship, you know, what this looked like. You know, I can remember And this was after we'd done a tremendous amount of work individually and together as a couple to repair our marriage. But I can remember you saying, or us having a conversation about, you know, one of the best things that we can do for our family right now, as we're older and still struggling with substance use, is to take really good care of each other, you know, and let them see that is one of the best ways that we can serve our children. And I thought, wow, that was profound, you know, because before that, and I know we talk about this in our parent group all the time, self-care or care for our relationships feels really selfish when our children are struggling, okay? Because you go and put the fire out. You don't do mundane things to take care of each other or the other kids that seem to be doing okay. You're constantly trying to save the one who is in trouble. But, you know, in hindsight, when things got better, we realized, no, it is taking care of yourself, taking care of this marriage, taking care of the other children, taking care of those things that needed to be taken care of is a healthy and proactive approach.
Whether that's your physical health, whether that's your spiritual health, your emotional health, your relational health, your economic health.
Yep.
If we don't pay attention to those in the right proportion, we're not going to be much good for anybody anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a big thing for us.
Yep.
Wow. Such a profound approach.
I
agree.
don't want folks to hear this and say, "Oh, we got it," and then it was a straight up stock market.
Oh, gosh,
No, there was 2 steps forward, 2 or 3 back, again forward, each of it individually as a marriage learning.
And this is a decade, really, process. Okay, this was not a year.
Okay.
This was a long
We were
process.
getting better in incremental
Yeah.
pieces
Yeah.
as we did the work, and as eventually we began to help other people do the work.
Okay. So, we started out with the behaviors. We leaned into the impact on the family. We leaned into the impact of the marriage. And then we loosely chronicled the recovery story, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I want to get into now is the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
You touched on it a little bit, Carrie, but thinking about the stigma, the guilt, I'm assuming you had to come face to face with that during recovery, and I'm sure after the fact. If you could tell us in your own words, like how that process was and how you dealt with that.
There was a real sense of failure and shame and that belief, if I don't do everything perfect, that somebody's going to get hurt. Well, then I felt like, okay, this is the perfect reality. Okay, because I couldn't do it right. You know, my sons have gone into such a dark place and are suffering.
And you were tempted to give up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Going into that darkness and hole and say, that's it, I'm done.
Walk away, you know. But I took that season and said, okay, I'm going to dig in. Because, you know, I was describing this to somebody the other day. Sometimes it takes, you know, a massive suffering to get you to a place to look at something differently and to give you the motivation to really work for change. Because change is hard. We talk in our parents group all the time.
Any change is hard.
Resistance to change. We have to, thinking about the loved one, the child that's struggling, we have to understand the reality of they have a great resistance of change. But guess what? We have a great resistance of change too. You know? So during that season, it's like, okay, the suffering was there. So why not lean in and learn all I can, you know, to get better, but then to grow stronger, to really not make me the center of all of this, okay? It's a family system. We all have lives and we do things, we make choices, we get in places we don't want to be, but those are individual choices, but we are a family together. So I think it was that brokenness and that suffering and that shame and that guilt that took me to a place. And finally, you know, I decided, okay, do I want to keep on dying or do I want to keep on living? So I decided I wanted to live, and I wanted to live better. So what does that look like? So that looked like a lot of work. That looked like a lot of forgiving. That looked like a lot of amends, a lot of saying, hey, I know that I did not contribute well in this situation. This is what I do realize. So tell me more, what do you need from me? That became our mantra with our kids, depending on where they were and what contact we had with them. Okay, what can we see in their lives that we can encourage? And then how can we let them, if they'll tell us, or let's read into that, what can we do that is of benefit to them right now? Instead of trying to control and trying to fix and trying to figure out what they need, let's look for little things to encourage and to learn how to relate with them. That's a blessing to them, not something I need or I want. It's what's best for them, So that was part of that process. And then building relationships, rebuilding relationships, because we got really isolated. Mm-hmm. And those relationships started in the recovery community, because so many people around us were dealing with that same guilt and shame. It's a really it's a really
safe place to do it.
Sweet place to build relationships with people because they understand where you're coming from.
And so many of them were ahead of us.
Yes,
that's a key. You find a community. There's people that have walked your road, but they're ahead. Not perfect, not complete, but they're ahead and they can guide you. They've already been to the places you're fixing to go to. And if you're willing to, this was the tough point for me, to humble myself to the place where I'd say to a specific person, hey, I need help. Would you help me? Yeah. And then they were willing to give me the help to stay in the process. When
I get the opportunity to talk to people, representing the Addiction Prevention Coalition, and they'll say, how did you get there, or whatever, I'll always say, this is not what I chose. It chose me. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if you would have told me 20 years ago this is what I'd be doing and whatever, I was like, what?
Yeah, we didn't plan this.
But
it has chosen us truly. And it's tough. I'll remember in the early years we were doing a men's step study, and when you get to the 12th step, they ask you a question, which I'd never been asked before. And it was like, well, if you knew you wouldn't fail, and you had every resource you needed, and you knew God wanted you to do this, what would you do? And I'd never been asked that before in my life, and so I struggled to try to write it down. And what I learned over the ensuing decades later is there's a second question that emerges, and it's, what do you have to keep doing even though it's hard and you fail all the time? And it's this. Yeah. It really is this. Yeah.
I want parents to hear that may be listening to this, that maybe are new to this place, that first of all, you're not alone. It's such a lonely place. You're doing the right thing. You're listening. You're learning. You're exploring. Find some people that are like you, to get better together. And there's hope. There really is hope, because in those dark, dark days, there's hopelessness, and that's where things begin to break down. Is that point of hopelessness, I think.
Mm-hmm. And there's that, as you said earlier, that critical mass of suffering, and everybody's got different details, right? Because one of the things you didn't mention earlier that we've talked about before in other settings was in that storm you were in, where all those different things were coming together. Your sister's diagnosis, she's going to die. That pretty vibrant young mother was going to die way too early. Your only sister, your father's dementia, and dealing with his disease, and your mother, our two sons, life itself, and then into the mix becomes 3 years in, as I'm working the steps, I finally have an awakening and can admit to you and the world my addiction, right, which came into the play too, all part of that storm.
Right.
And so there's all these ups and downs and lines along these 20-something years we're talking about, in which we had to make choices or choices had to kind of be presented to us. Do you want to live or do you want to die? I don't mean necessarily physically, although that was a temptation too, but do you really want to live, or do you want to keep wallowing in this and stay in your position, or do we want to respond and keep moving? And I don't say that lightly as if it was easy and we were smart and just jumped at every chance. But as you said, choosing to take the first step, which says to somebody specifically, I need some help, would you help me? And then moving and staying and trusting the process you get in community with people is not something any of us would have ever said. Yeah, at some point in life, that's how my life's going to go. That's what I'm going to enter into. I'm going to go into a room and over the door it says recovery, and nobody chooses that. But it has been as painful as it's been, as hard as it's been, as long as it's been. It's actually been a beautiful story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in closing, I would say my biggest encouragement to parents is start to seek some help outside of the home, because that can be a real dark place and isolated, whether that's a counselor. And if there's a family support group anywhere near you, please go. Because we watch people walk into the room. We have a group on Thursday nights, and we watch new people walk in, and they're afraid, they're ashamed. They sit down, and
they're angry,
and they're angry,
tired,
and they're terrified. But just as we go around the circle and introduce ourselves, talk about our loved one that has brought us there, what their drug of choice is, what their use is like.
How long have we been on the journey?
Yeah, just that simple introduction as we go around the circle, and you see them, something fall off of them, their shoulders. They sit, in the seat more, because for the very first time, maybe ever, they realize they're in a group of people that really, really, really understands what they're going through. And they haven't had that before. And it's so important. That is as important as anything else that's talked about. It's just being known and being seen, and know that you're not alone, And then learning, the education is critically important. Education is power. Power for us to get better. Power for us to learn what we can do to contribute positively in our sons or daughters' lives that we're so concerned about, but also that support of just sharing what's going on and being heard is truly a significant part of the healing process, to get stronger, to learn what self-care looks like, to learn what it looks like to help, get back into the life of your family, to find joy again, which seems almost unheard of when you walk in that room. But it's so critical for you to continue to get stronger to help your loved one.
Do we want to close with just giving people a link to get to the Addiction Prevention Coalition and some of the resources?
Yeah, on our website, apcbham.org. We have lots of resources on there. We have a parent toolbox for parents that actually have young children and want to learn about prevention. We have all kinds of resources as their children are getting into middle school, learning education about how to have those conversations, learning about drug refusal strategies, all kinds of things around prevention. But we also have a page on there for parents who are dealing with a son or daughter that has some substance use. So there's signs and symptoms, that we talked about. There's lots of different resources there. And then all of these recordings that we're doing for this family support initiative this year will be on that webpage under teachings, so that they can look at all of those whenever they want to. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ronnie, thanks.
No problem.
Yeah.
Okay, we're back. So a really good question in the chat about siblings, the younger kids at home dealing with their older brother's use. And certainly that was an issue. And I think they were asking about suggestions coming to recovery groups. I think in our case, and Art, you can help me with this, but I think it has been part of the younger son's personal journeys.
There was definitely the question asker mentioned the idea of resentment, and that was definitely there. It was kind of hidden, but it started to come out later. The two younger over the years have had to deal with their own resentments, and part of our job in those days back then, when they were still in our home, was finding the appropriate help for them, whether it was counseling for them about what's going on, having frank conversations with them at an age appropriate level about what we were having to deal with, without exposing information they didn't need to know, but also being able to give them a place where they could talk through it and figure out what kind of help they needed at the age they were that was appropriate, or the level. And I think each of them would tell you as adults now that they had to handle it on their own in their own way, but they were thankful that we at least were honest with them about it and gave them.
I think looking back, I don't think, I know I did not have the education around addiction and substance use disorder that I have now. I wish I had had more because I think we could have had more educational conversations with the younger boys. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I
especially that first year. Yeah, especially that first year and a half or two, we just didn't have it ourselves. I think it was crucial. Once we got that, we began to understand family dynamics a little bit better.
And I thought that if we bring it up all the time and tell them everything that's going on, that they're going to be influenced in the wrong way. And I don't think that was true. So I think that was fear-based.
Yeah.
Okay.
As far as the what to do to try to discourage use, first thing is don't panic. I think that's one of the things we tend to do as parents. If we panic, but find a way to get educated yourself. As Carrie said earlier, that information and knowledge is power to change. The APC has resource after resource. There's a lot of other places in Alabama that you can get information, educate yourself. Don't put off having the good conversations, but don't panic about them, and make it a safe place for your other children to be able to say anything they need to say about that.
And we did take, our younger sons to family weekend that one week. You remember that?
Yep.
And I think that was a little bit scary, especially for our youngest son. But they were encouraged to participate. I know they wrote letters and read them. And so I think overall it was a good experience. It was a little stressful, but I think it was good.
Yeah, I do too.
All right, so we're going to finish up just a few more slides here, and then we'll be, I'm going to tell you what's coming up in the series, and then if you guys have anything else you want to talk about, we'll be happy to. So as Art said, we kind of added a fourth C and said, okay, these are the things you can't do, but you can do something. You can contribute. So, early on, the realization of, okay, a lot of our contribution is around trying to control and manipulate. So what does it look like to choose to contribute positively. And this is just a quote from a counselor that we use some material in our support group. And she said, addiction is a family disease where everybody has a role. And if everyone is in recovery together, then the family can get healthy quicker. And we certainly have seen that to be true, because as we all started working, when our sons began to get better, then it did, I think it created an environment where when they were ready, we were ready to start rebuilding and coming back together.
So some of the ways that we want to think about, we're either going to, as Carrie said, we're going to contribute either negatively or positively. So here are some things we can think about that would be positive. It's critical to focus on self-care, marriage, family relationship. We talked a lot about that live and in the video, and I can't over stress it, because the first thing that typically goes by the wayside when substance use disorder becomes a crisis in a family is people stop taking care of themselves and their relationships. So you have to kind of be brought back to that reality. So it's critical. We've talked about, again, participate in education and support. The group we do on Thursday night has a little of both. We usually have an educational lesson we work through together about addiction and recovery, and then we have a time of open share and support. The other thing Carrie has mentioned, and we talked about in our story, is get out of isolation as quickly as you can. In fact, if you can avoid it, don't ever get into isolation. I think we're better at that as a culture now. We've reduced some of the stigma. So perhaps it's a little easier for folks to quickly seek out help. But if you feel like you're isolating yourself or being isolated, quickly find a way to get somebody to a place that people can guide you toward help. And then the personal work could be in a 12-step group like Al-Anon. We do what we call a PAL group, parents of addicted loved ones. Doesn't have to be just parents, it could be any family member or significant other that wants to come. Consider getting a sponsor. It sounds radical for people that if you think you're not the person struggling with addiction, but believe me, it's been a lifesaver for us. Maybe a life coach, therapist, counselor, pastoral counseling to do the personal work. Carrie?
So, another big part, we talk about this a lot with our parents, is grieving. A lot of us don't know really how to grieve well. And even though, our children may, they're still out there, there is a grief associated with them dealing with a substance use disorder. There are dreams that you have as parents about your children and where they would be at this age and stage, where you would be as a family at this age and stage, milestones that you were looking forward to, and all of that represents loss. So that's another reason to get some help, is because grief is a big part of this journey for family members. And we talked about this in the video, but, getting to a place where you're able to, even when they're, not in a good place, if you have contact with them, listening and really searching for things to be able to encourage, speaking to them as adults, giving them the encouragement that that they're going to figure it out, that they're going to find their way, they're going to find their path. Because they're dealing, we're dealing with guilt and shame. They're dealing with a ton of guilt and shame too. And then acknowledging delayed emotional growth. I think we mentioned this, part of substance use disorder, especially for kids that start early, it delays their emotional growth. So when they start getting better, even though they're 30, they may be acting like they're 18. And so also as parents, maybe they're 30 and I still see them as 15 and I'm treating them as a 15-year-old. So that's another lesson and another thing that we need to learn as parents.
And learning to be both realistic and optimistic at the same time. It's one of the more challenging things, I think, for human beings to do, but especially when it comes to substance use disorder crisis within a family, especially if it's been going on a long time. Some of us are built to be way more realistic and probably pessimistic. Some of us, like myself, are probably way too optimistic and not very realistic. So we have to have help kind of balancing those types of things. And the last thing we want to talk about in terms of contribution is, if you've been on the journey for a while, you've got some stability, and you've learned some things, look for ways to give back. Maybe it's helping facilitate a group, or sponsoring someone, or volunteering with organizations. But as you get some stability and some education, and begin to stabilize, look for ways to give back, not just for the giving, but one of the things that giving back does for all of us is it actually contributes to our own continuing recovery and maturing process.
All right, so I was looking at the questions, and here's one as I move forward. Art, what do you do when you feel responsible to help them financially because this happens over and over and over again?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that probably 90 to 95% of the folks that we've encountered in this 23 years we've been at this, sooner or later, it usually comes up for most families. One of the things you have to try to begin to figure out within a group setting, within a therapeutic setting, a counseling setting is, as Carrie said earlier, what are the emotions underneath that are driving my reactions to continuing to help? Where do I begin to know how to set healthy boundaries without putting up unnecessary barriers to communication? We generally all need help from somebody other than just ourselves or our spouse in learning that process, because what we need to handle these types of situations, nobody grows up having that knowledge. Nobody gets married, has children, knowing they're going to need this type of knowledge. And so a big part of the financial hurdle for most people is, what are the motivations underneath? Why do I continue to financially support when I can probably am seeing that it's actually hurting them and not helping? And that often takes a good bit of either counseling work or a good bit of sponsor work, working the steps, doing educational lessons, and then getting the emotional support when you figure out how to pull back financially. I hope that helps though.
All right, we're running out of time. So just want to run through these real quick. Right now we've got craft trainings, that's community reinforcement, and what is it?
Transformation.
Family training. And so there's different locations. Certainly reach out if you're interested in those. What's coming up in the series, the next webinar is going to talk about vaping and addiction. And this is really for parents of middle schoolers and high schoolers with the vaping epidemic that's going on right now, with some great information about that. That's on June the 29th. Then we'll have the topics and techniques for family discussion. That's going to be by the Birmingham Recovery Center on August the 10th. And then on September the 13th, the Invitation to Change approach, Not One More from Huntsville, is going to be leading that webinar. It's going to be fantastic. And if you guys can give us some feedback right here, we sure would appreciate it. This is just a very quick, you can use your phone, your camera on your phone to scan that QR code. I will also, again, send out an email with the recording and with this link. And I'm going to beg you in that email to give us some feedback because we really do want to get better with each one of these. Okay, any other questions? We have 2 minutes. I don't see anything in there. We really do appreciate you guys. I know your evenings are precious. Ours are too. So the fact that you would share your evening with us means a lot. We hope this was helpful. If APC can help you guys in any way, please let us know, and please stay connected to us for future webinars.
And Carrie, for those that are out there that are local, if they're looking for a support group,
Yes.
Family support, you don't have to be a parent, just it could be a concerned significant other for somebody that struggles. They can contact you at that number or the number we had up for me earlier, that we can give you information about the local PAL groups.
Yep. Several groups around Birmingham. So, and there's lots of room for you. So feel free to reach out. We would love to help you get connected. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great evening.
Good night.